Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our second day of Space Fest 2021. We're so glad that you could join us again today. We have many wonderful conversations this afternoon, both from people working at the University of Minnesota. We hope that you've had a chance to explore our website and see everything that we've been doing yesterday and continue on today. And we hope that you'll continue on this journey with us as we learn more about astrobiology. We first want to thank Ruth and John Huss, who help support Minnesota's astronomy classroom, and that includes a lot of the astronomy programming that we're able to do at the Bell Museum. I'm Amber Kastner, the Public Science Events Manager here at the Bell, and this afternoon I'm excited to introduce some speakers from the University of Minnesota. Our first guest is Burckhard Seelig. He is a biochemist working at the University of Minnesota, and in their lab, they're seeking out the origins of life. And he's always been fascinated, he said, with the origins of life, and he considers himself very lucky now to be able to work with other researchers and students to pursue this work. This work is very important in our understanding of life on Earth and also life possibly elsewhere. And so some of his work in the lab is actually funded by NASA. And so I'm going to turn things over to Burckhard so he can tell us more about the work in their labs.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this little presentation. I'm very excited to share what we do for a living and for money, actually, even with you who are plainly interested in this. I will start with a very general question here, which probably many of you have asked yourself before, which is there life out there in the universe? Right? It's a very tantalizing question, and it's kind of the theme of this year's Space Fest. And the honest answer is we really don't know. We really simply don't know. But what we do know is there's definitely life on Earth, right? We're here. That's proof enough. And so for us, in order to understand whether there might be additional life out there in the universe, we think it's very helpful to first try to understand, well, what did it take really for life to appear on Earth? So we're studying the appearance of life on Earth, the emergence of life, the origin of life. And we are biochemists, as Amber already introduced me. And so we do it from the biochemist's perspective. And I first want to give you kind of a little background introduction here. When we look at life as biochemists, we look at the building blocks of life. What does it take for life to really function? And I'm sure many of you have heard of the different blocks of life, and I'm focusing here on the DNA, the genetic information where all the information is stored. And we also really focus on our lab on proteins. So proteins are those molecules that make everything happen in biology. So your hair, for example, is made from proteins. Your skin is made from proteins. When you eat something, I hope you had a nice breakfast or lunch today, and the molecules that break down your food and turn it into energy, those are proteins. So proteins are very important, and they really make everything happen in life. But I said earlier, the information for life is stored in the DNA, and the process from reading the information in the DNA and turning it into proteins is called translation. So it's really like the normal translation. As you can easily tell, my mother tongue is German, but today I'm trying to speak English. And for that, I have to translate from one language, German, into another language, English. And that's the same for the DNA and the proteins. So the proteins are made from amino acids. Those are small little chemicals. And those chemicals are strung like on a chain of pearls or making a long spaghetti. And those spaghettis, they're called peptides. And sometimes those peptides actually knot up and fold, we call that, into a more compact structure. And that we will then call a protein. But honestly, a peptide and a protein, they're not all that different. You can think of a peptide as being a simple protein, okay? So that are arguably the most essential building blocks of life. And we want to understand the origin of life, as I told you before. So for that reason, we of course then wonder, where did those building blocks come from? At the very, very early times of life. Well, we're basically looking for the ancestors. And you've all thought about ancestors for sure, because you have probably siblings, and even if not, you for sure have parents, a father and a mother, and even your father and your mother have parents, which then you call, of course, grandparents, and so on. So those are your ancestors, and you can go back because the grandparents that you have, they have grandparents themselves, and so on. So you can go back for hundreds, thousands, honestly, for millions of years. And the same idea here of trying to find the ancestors, that's what we are doing with proteins. So here on the right, you see some 3 examples of modern proteins. So the proteins that are making up my hair or my skin or other parts of me. And they, of course, have parents and grandparents. And there is a whole genealogy that you can follow back. Well, it's actually really hard to follow back because this goes back literally billions of years. But this is what we are interested in. We're trying to figure out what the earliest grandparents of those modern proteins could have looked like. So what were those very early proteins like? And of course, you can imagine that is really hard because we will never really find dinosaur bones, because those early proteins, they're way, way, way before dinosaur bones. So there is actually no hope that we'll find fossils of the earliest proteins because it's just too far back. But there is still a lot of things that we can do. On the upper left here in this slide, I have an artist's rendition of what scientists think early Earth looked like. So by early Earth, I mean the planet Earth before there was life on it. So no people, not even bacteria, not even cells, just the crude planet Earth. And this picture here is informed, even though it's a piece of art, it's informed by scientists like geologists or planetary scientists who study this and to try to figure out what was early Earth like. And they are pretty sure that there was water on early Earth. And of course, there was land. And then there was a lot of volcanism. So you can see here in the distance a volcano. That makes a lot of smoke. And then those volcano clouds, they cause a lot of lightning that you can see here, which is a lot of energy. So it was a very wild place. And even the sun peeks through the clouds here at some parts. So why is that important? Why is that interesting? Well, we want to find out how the first peptides were possibly made. And I briefly mentioned that those peptides are made from those building blocks, amino acids. So the amino acids are basically the Lego blocks that you can put together to make a peptide. And the chemists, they take what they learn from the geologists and the planetary scientists, and they try to do an experiment in the lab. Now, several billion years later, today. So they take very simple gases that people believe were around on early Earth. They take water and they take high energy. So here, this scientist here actually has 2 electrodes that have little lightning between them. And down in the left here, there's water and they heat it up and it bubbles and there's steam. And they let this, basically this kind of alchemy primordial soup, as they coined this, they let this bubble for a few days and then analyze what happened in there. And sure enough, something happened, because from those very simple chemicals, those gases and water, things reacted purely by chemistry, not through any life, just by chemical reactions. And they were actually really surprised. So this is a few decades old when Miller and Urey did this experiment for the first time, but they found, among other things, amino acids. So the very building blocks of life, the ones you need to make peptides. So that was super exciting, because that means that on early Earth, before there was life, very likely there were amino acids around. There's another connection I want to make, and this is in the upper right corner here of the slide. People, you've all seen the meteor showers, or many of you have, and you are in awe when those things streak around the sky. Well, some of those meteorites actually make it to Earth, and then people collect them and they analyze them. And sure enough, they found chemicals on those meteorites that come from outer space. And they find amino acids. Not very many, but they find some amino acids on meteorites. So what does that mean? Well, it probably does not mean that there's definitely life out there in space, but it more likely means that chemistry just happening out in space can make amino acids. Again, those building blocks of life. So chemistry before biology can make the building blocks. And my group and my researcher friends and other researcher teams around the world use this knowledge and try to evolve peptides in the lab. And that's what I want to show you in the last 2-3 slides. That's what we do. So we are trying to make early peptides in a test tube. It's here at the university, as Amber said earlier. It's literally less than a mile away from the Bell Museum. So if you next time, hopefully come to the Bell Museum, within 15 minutes, you could be in front of the building where I do those experiments. Those experiments, what are we actually doing? We are synthesizing little peptides, but in a random fashion. So we just by chance, completely randomly string up those amino acids and we make little peptides. And if you make one little random peptides, that is probably not good for anything. It has nothing to do with today's biological proteins. But we do this many times over. We literally can do this through some chemical tricks. So we are also chemists in a way. We can literally do trillions of random peptides, and we all have them in a tiny little test tube. And then when we make them, and again, most of them are not good for anything, but we search for some that might be good for something, so that we search for peptides that have a biological function. And the biological function is what I said earlier. Hair is made from peptides, from proteins, and those need to, for example, bind to each other. Other peptides, other proteins, they need to break down things. So those are all biological functions. You can think of all those functions that make a living cell alive. And we test those trillions of random peptides for those very rare molecules that might have a real function, because if we can find them, then this could really be the way how the very first biological peptides may have come about. I have one more slide I want to share with you before I hopefully get some questions, because I'm sure this is not all straight and clear here. But remember what I showed you on the earlier slide, this translation from the genetic information in the DNA into the proteins. So this translation is actually a translation from an alphabet of 4 letters in the DNA to 20 letters in the proteins, which are 20 amino acids. And this nice, beautiful, colorful wheel is the genetic code. This tells you how those 4 letters in the circle, in the center of the circle here, are translated in those 20 amino acids that biology nowadays uses. And they have funny names like serine or valine or you name it. So this is the genetic code of today, but we in the lab try to find ancestors of this genetic code. Because if you think of it, this genetic code of 20 amino acids did not poof, come overnight and life decided, let's use this translation. Like languages, like German language or English language, they evolve over time. And so we're trying to now go backwards and take today's modern 20 amino acid genetic code and find ancestors of that is made up by early amino acids, probably fewer, probably simpler amino acids. So in our lab, we're trying to study with real experiments how the first steps of life could potentially have happened. We will never really be able to prove that this is how life really originated. But what our goal is to find scenarios how life could have maybe originated. With that, I want to conclude and really change my question from the very beginning, where I asked, is there life out there in the universe? We actually have another question, which is there more life out there in the universe? Meaning life like ours here on Earth, but maybe even different life, life with different alphabets, maybe even not with proteins, but with other molecules. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you guys can use the, I guess, the chat function, I assume, and post some questions that I would be happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Burckhard, for sharing that with us. We do have some questions coming in and a couple of hellos from around the state and around Wisconsin as well. If you do have a question, please go ahead and just type it in the comments on Facebook and I will share that. The first one that I had, I think, is someone who actually probably does research in a similar area. And Allison is wondering how prions fit into this conversation, and that is if they possibly could have anything to do with the origins of life.
Okay, so most people, I assume, do not really know what prions are. And I really am not a specialist expert in that either, but those are little proteins, little peptides that have really weird functions. And because I'm not an expert in it, I will be tread very lightly here and not explain things that I don't really understand. But what I want to say is that life is still a mystery. Even though I'm doing research every day on the origins of life, we do not understand it well. And so there are quite a number of different hypotheses, so theories out there, how life could have originated. And what I encourage everybody to do is to try and test hypotheses, because having a hypothesis is a very, very good starting point. But it is much more powerful if you can actually come up with some experiments to test whether your hypothesis is right or wrong. And either way, it's worthwhile. Even if you find out what your hypothesis was is probably wrong, that's still worthwhile doing. So sorry for really avoiding that question, though.
No, I appreciate that. Jennifer, I think, is wondering just more about your lab and like how long you've been doing this work or how long the lab's been open, and just elaborating on that.
Yeah, so I have started my work in the origins of life field with my PhD work that I still did in Germany. After that, I came to Boston for a little research stint where I learned more, which then prepared me to start at the University of Minnesota. And that was 12 years ago. And you start really small. First, you're all alone in your lab. And then if you're really lucky, you can recruit graduate students or two. And that's what I did. And that's what we've been doing ever since. And I actually brought something that I gave my children as a gift. So those are little tubes. I said evolution in a test tube earlier. And those are literally the test tubes here. Those are bigger ones. You can screw them open. You can fill stuff in them. But actually here, the small one, the little one, look at this one. You can open it, okay? And you can fill in something. And when I talked about those trillions of little peptides that we make with chemical tricks, it all fits in this tiny little test tube. And even those trillions, they are so small because they're so tiny, I can't even see them. So they might be in this little water droplet here. But that's literally from my laboratory.
That's amazing. You can actually have a very small space to do your work, it seems like.
Yes, so even though we are funded by NASA and we're doing really, I think, unusual research that not too many people do. So it's not rocket science. It is actually, the methods we use to test those origin of life questions are very simple, standard methods that everybody uses that studies biology or biochemistry at the university. So when a high school student starts at the university, often after, maybe some even in their first year, but often maybe second year, they start doing some research. And we have those students that are basically fresh out of high school, and they can learn within a matter of a few weeks to make those peptides and handle those test tubes and do those experiments. So even though we think that the questions we're trying to answer are very fundamental and great, the stuff it actually takes to do it is very simple. Anybody can learn that. Anybody who's interested and excited can be part of this.
So the next question came in from Jeff, and Jeff is wondering how natural selection might be part of this, how it takes part in the origins of life. Is that something that you're studying?
Yes, so we have a really good understanding of natural selection, right? People have for thousands of years used natural selection to come up with better crops or with better livestock, right? The dogs we have, they came from wolves, but they do not look like wolves at all anymore, right? So this is natural selection. Actually, the breeding is already kind of artificial selection, right? We call it breeding, but this is us deciding who's supposed to have the offspring and who we don't want to have to mate and make offspring. Natural selection doesn't have this plan, but natural selection, the ones that are fittest survive. The ones that can swim, they can live in the lake and the ocean. The other ones drown, right? But we use those principles of survival of the fittest in the lab, in the test tube. So this test tube evolution is actually exactly the same as evolution out in nature, only that we decide who survives and who is not going to make it. So it's literally survival of the fittest, but in our case, it's not little dogs that are prettier or furrier, but it's actually little proteins that have a better function than maybe the other proteins. So we pick the proteins with the best function.
Okay. So as you were talking about your lab and showing some of the equipment, Kristen, excuse me, had asked a question and is wondering a little bit more about the equipment that you actually use to analyze the peptides.
That's a very good question, because I just told you that they're so tiny that we can't even see them, right? So how do you then even know that they're even in there, right? So I'm at home, as you can tell, in our guest bedroom, so not in the lab. Otherwise, I could show you some equipment. But there are some fancy machines with computers, and they're thousands of dollars worth, and they help us to analyze those peptides. But it's hard from home to really explain them. But maybe I give you one example. You've heard that one can sequence the human genome, right? A decade ago, this was really, really difficult. Now, actually, people do it when someone has a certain cancer disease. My wife is actually a cancer doctor. And when they want to find out what specific cancer that is, they actually take a little bit of their DNA and they sequence the DNA, in that case, of the cancer cell. But they also can sequence your DNA to, again, find out who your ancestors might have been, right? So you've heard of the DNA sequencing method. And we use that a lot, because all our little peptides and proteins, they are encoded in the DNA. So when I say we do experiments with peptides, not entirely true. We always have the DNA in there also. And the DNA is much easier to analyze because you can use this sequencing. It's called sequencing, the way they sequence, they analyze your genome. So we use methods that other people have invented for totally other purposes to look at our little peptides.
Okay. So Bill has a question, and it sounds like Bill is also familiar with this area of research. Bill is wondering that he's saying that some think that clays, as in I'm assuming clay soils, once served as a catalyst for assembling amino acids, and is wondering if your experiments are suggesting other mechanisms for assembling amino acids on early Earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that Bill clearly has looked into this subject a little bit before. I told you about two different building blocks of life in the beginning. I said DNA is important and proteins are important. However, we focus on proteins and peptides and amino acids, right? But DNA is arguably even more important for the origin of life. And there were studies where people looked at how can you make the very first pieces of DNA, right? Before you had a grandparent and you could just get it from your parents then. And people looked at clays, but also many different other minerals that clearly have been around on early Earth, if they could have helped for the very first cells to form and for the very first chemicals to kind of align and make those first little random spaghettis that I told you about. Same is true for DNA. And so people have found really interesting effects when they added clay to those very early chemistry experiments. that clay really helped those first early little pieces of, wasn't even DNA, but something similar, RNA specifically, to form. And yeah, that was very interesting. And people, I'm sure, as I speak today, people are still studying this and following up this hypothesis. But there are also other minerals that people are very interested in because they might have helped to start up this chemistry process in the beginning, right? So this is more about the time even before biology, before life, where the building blocks might have been around by chemistry. How could they have assembled to form something that we would recognize as the first cell?
Okay. So you've talked a lot about the building blocks, and Ken, I think, is wondering about those building blocks. When does a collection of molecules cross over to actually being considered life?
That is a question that is at the heart of what we do. And it's the one question that will be answered by everyone differently. So there are, if you search out there are many different definitions on what life really is. And I can give you one or two or three, but it's really, how meaningful is that? So people, an important aspect of life, most people consider that there is some kind of genetic information that can be inherited. So they consider something alive that is able to have inheritable information and that can then go on, have offspring, and evolve, meaning becoming better and more complex. And that's one of the definitions. But there are many different definitions. And yeah, that makes it all the more interesting that people can't even really agree on what exactly life is.
Yep, excellent. It's not always the clearest of answers.
And
so
we cannot even agree how to define life on Earth. And now we're wondering, is there life out in the universe, which might be different kind of life? So even if we could agree on a definition for our kind of life, well, would that definition then still apply to life that might be out there or not, that is evolving or not, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So speaking of that, I think we have time for one final question, and this one actually comes from Dan, and I think it's a good way to maybe wrap up our session here. Dan wants to know if you think life originated or evolved only once here on Earth, or if you think it might happen more or might have happened more than once.
We do not know.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not, I'm not even sure if it will ever be possible to find out and answer that question, yes or no. But what we try to do is to find out how difficult it is to create life. And it's a funny word to use, create life, for life to appear. And just with you have heard of animals that have gone extinct, right? So they were there, but they're not there anymore. So just the fact that we don't see them today doesn't mean they never existed, right? Sometimes we find bones and we say, oh, they must have been there, right? So then we know. But for life, maybe there was even slightly different life on Earth at some point, and it just went extinct. Entirely possible. Will we ever be able to fully say yes or no? I don't think so.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Our audience was super engaged and asked a lot of really wonderful questions. I hope that you had a great time being here today and answering those questions. I want to thank you once again, Burckhard, for being here. Hopefully everyone at home is also thanking you from their living rooms or from their couches. We have one more session for Space Fest this afternoon. We have another group from the University of Minnesota, 2 graduate students who are studying subglacial microbes. So little tiny microorganisms that live in extreme environments. And they'll be telling us more about that and then how it might apply to what we might find in life and elsewhere in the universe. So that'll be happening at 3 o'clock. We hope that you'll join us again for that final talk of Space Fest. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye.